my friends, it's Alexander Williamson here with The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium. So today we want to do a different episode. We're going to do an episode where I am telling you a very, very large story. And I'm sure I'll be leaving parts out, might be getting parts wrong. But in the spirit of Thanksgiving, I wanted to talk about where we came from as a species, humans. And some new research that recently came out that talks about just how intertwined we have been with fish as a species for up to 1 million years or more, if not way more. And as an aquarist, I know that a lot of you may be interested in this sort of thing, but it's not necessarily a video about keeping fish in any tangible way. It's a video about our relationship with fish, how fish have been a part of us and have literally helped allow us to become human. They are the protein, they are the extra calories, they are the cooked food that allowed humans to get omega fatty acids and high dense caloric proteins, vitamins, and nutrients to grow big brains, to walk upright, and to come forth into what is today. So in the spirit of Thanksgiving, we won't go into any controversies about that holiday, but in the thought of gathering around and eating and being with friends, family, and people from our species, people from Homo sapien, people from all over the world, different races, cultures, genders, whatever. I wanted to tell you guys a story, and it's all based on research, but I want to tell it in a way that's quick enough. It'll still be a very deep dive, but it's quick enough that I'm not going to go down all the rabbit trails. If you guys are interested in any particular part of this, we can come back and revisit it, or maybe there's material out there I can refer you to. But we are going to go all the way back several million years, maybe more, to when humans were first becoming human. And before we had luxuries of things like clothing to keep us warm, things like shelter, fire, and talking about how fire and cooking food, specifically fish, now appears to play a large role in our speciation of the world. So we're going to go back, we're going to look at some images that are going to show you some amazing things, some things you may not quite believe. For instance, have primates like orangutans, have they entered the Stone Age now by simply watching us and learning from us? Have chimpanzees and gorillas also entered some sort of Stone Age? They're actually valid questions we're wrestling with. They're not ancient aliens on the History Channel type material. They are actual anthropological questions that we are trying to understand. And let's go back to why this recent publication and find in Israel that we're going to talk about, that dates us back nearly 1 million years to purposefully cooking food. And we're going to talk about the science of how they know that this meant we were cooking food and that it was fish and that we were there and it was humans and et cetera, et cetera. But I also want to talk about how we came forward all the way to the ancient age. So this is not history, this is prehistory. We are going to be talking about before it was written down, and much of that has been erased because it's made out of wood, stone, bones, and fibers from plants. But with new technology, new dating technology, and new chemical analysis technology, we are finding out more than we've ever known about what it is to be human. And I want to take you guys on a journey about that. So let's start off right now, and I want to show you guys just how special it is to be human and how many other hominids failed for us to succeed, and the fact that Neanderthal and Denisovans and maybe a few others may also be part of who we are genetically. In fact, we know for a fact that Denisovans and Neanderthals are a part of anybody who left Africa around 200,000 years ago. And so we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about these findings that are 790,000 years old, almost 1,000,000 years old, that totally change everything we know about human development, Homo sapien development, hominid development. And then we're going to go forward and talk about some fishing practices, fish keeping, and horticulture or aquaculture practices that spread around the world. And we're talking all pretty much pre 5 to 10,000 years ago. So pre what you would think of as organized society, probably. So I hope you guys enjoy this video, and I hope we can kind of loosely talk about it, skip over things. I'm not going to cover 1,000,000 years in detail, but with my background as an archaeologist, I find it so fascinating how we evolved from creatures, you know, single cell, wherever you want to start, but on to creatures in the sea, creatures with lungs, creatures with blood that carries oxygen. All this genetic material that we still save, our eyes, how they work, and our brainstem and our limbic system, how that is all connected to how we evolved from fish. There's a book called Your Inner Fish that actually talks about all the ways in which we have kept the parts of our evolutionary history that fish developed, or at least their common ancestors, to be more accurate. And so in this, you're going to have to set aside any thoughts of the Earth being 6,000 years old. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to debate that, but let's just say it's in a timeline that everyone in science agrees on, and you can have your timeline. But this is what the hard evidence shows, and I'm not trying to argue, and that's the end of that. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about how we are part of these creatures, or they are part of us, and how we now master them and control them and keep them, and how that happened, and how closely related they are to us being who we are physically, psychologically, culturally, emotionally, and spiritually. So let's talk about it. Let's take a look at how humans became humans and started interacting with fish. Okay, so if we go back in time all the way to when we had a common ancestor with the fish in the sea, something living not quite on land, you can see that is a long time ago. That's through a lot of different body permutations. Here is a chart showing kind of your classical evolution, going from your single tiniest cells all the way up through the kind of Darwinian chimpanzee, through caveman to modern human look, and all the mammals and everything in between. So if we look back, that is something like 400 to 500 million years ago that we are sea-dwelling creatures. Yet, when we look at this fact here, it reminds us how tied life is. And when something works, it really works, and it stays in a species. So this says 70% of the same genes in zebrafish are in humans, and 84% of the genes that humans have to be known associates of disease are the same in the zebrafish or zebra danio. So I just want that to sink in, that is why we still do scientific studies with zebra danios, because there is such, a similarity. Now, genetically speaking, yes, we are similar to all life on Earth. We're like 30% the same as a banana or whatnot. So that may not be the most amazing fact that we're 70% the same as fish, but I just want to bring it home that we have gone through these evolutionary changes, like gaining eyesight, like having pigment, like understanding needing a mate, and hunting and gathering behavior, searching for food, taking care of young. All the things we see in fish, it's not like they stopped evolving, but we have these common genes of the way life forms work. And, just like our cells grow old and die, theirs do. Just like, the eyesight of a human works, there are very similar ways in which the eyes of fish work. Now, other evolutionary things have happened since then, and let's just kind of fast forward and say that 370 million years ago, amphibians start. 320 million years ago, reptiles with four limbs are out of the water and doing their thing. And by 160 million years ago, this is, dinosaur era, we start seeing simple mammals like shrews and things. And then we see the ones that are like lemurs, and, maybe we go from a shrew to a rat to a raccoon to a lemur to a monkey. Monkey-like creatures and lemurs, if you include like Madagascar and everything, 55 million years ago is when we first see those arriving. And then it is not until literally 200,000 years ago, arguably maybe up to 800,000 years ago. It is up for debate when and where you want to say that we became the humans we are today. But we share those genes. We did have a completely separate evolution, so 30% or so of our genes are going to be different. But we still share the same, need for oxygen, the same basic things in a universe full of possibilities of life. 70% are still the same. Now, we're going to be talking about not just that, but the fact that we are linked to all those other late mammals. The last 6 million years or so, the hominids come in. The hominids are human-like primates, essentially. So there are many, many, many dead ends in this chain, and some of them were probably nearly as advanced as us, mentally speaking. Some were better than us, adapted in, to the cold, like Neanderthalensis. Others were probably less so, like Easter. Homo habilis is another one that you find in Africa, and that is, upright and has a very, very similar skull and just slightly smaller brain size than ours, and we're talking 2 million years ago. So really, most of the action we're going to be talking about that is this discovery, that is this Thanksgiving dinner discussion that I want to give you guys to have, is going on in the last few million years in our branch of the hominins. And the hominins, we're talking about Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo sapiens, that's us, Homo neanderthals, Homo denisovans, which are not on this chart here, but, if you're listening, I'm trying to narrate this so you can just listen without looking, but there's a wing of this chart, and below, you have to go back 6 to 8 million years before we branch off to even a common ancestor with a bonobo or a chimpanzee, and those are 98.9% the same as us genetically. So really, we're talking about Neanderthal and Heidelbergensis, Homo sapien, Homo erectus. All of us are going to be something like 99.5 or 99.8% similar, yet most of these species died out. Now, the important part is to mention that at the time of the findings that we just recently found in the last million years, which on the chart, if you're watching, at the 1 here to the 0, we have Homo erectus dying out probably by 500,000 years ago, somewhere in there. But really we have Heidelbergensis, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalis, and Homo Denisovin that are probably at some point interbreeding. Now, if you want to think of gorillas as being great apes and, you know, even relatives of ours, you have to go all the way back to something like 10 or 11 million years ago before we shared a common ancestor. So we really are fairly different from them, even though a lot of times people like to point out how similar we are. But why are we doing all this background? Because of this. This is the essence of what it is to be human, to think. And if you look at the brain, self-awareness, and if you look at the brain at the top there, that is Neanderthalis, and that is Homo sapien. And Homo neanderthalensis, or Neanderthalis, that is, you know, kind of typically, historically, was seen as kind of this brutish caveman with a big brow. But it turns out that they actually had brains, in some cases, larger than ours, and were probably more advanced in their stone tool making than us. And now it turns out that everybody who left Africa somewhere around 200,000 years ago, give or take, probably has some Neanderthal, and if they went west, they have Neanderthal and Homo sapien, which is us currently, and if they went east, they have Neanderthal and they have Denisovin, if not maybe a few others. We just don't know for sure the DNA on the others. It's too old to know yet. Hopefully we'll have that technology soon, but what I want to point out is that, you know, from 3 million years ago, the average brain of our other hominin ancestors, they were around 500 cubic centimeters of tissue. By 2 million years ago, we're talking about maybe 600 to 800 cubic centimeters of tissue, like Homo habilis. Homo egaster, kind of, we start seeing a change around 1.9 million years ago, and that is when our first interaction with fish is archaeologically proven. So we recently, is in the last 10 years, have found a site in modern day Kenya. And so just for an idea of where all this is happening, let's zoom in. Ironically, Kenya is also a source of a lot of where, you know, fish lovers, where we get fish from the Rift Lakes and from Lake Victoria and from all these lakes that are in the Rift area, Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Democratic being a joke, you know, and Kenya, South Sudan, some of the rivers up in here, and the Congo, you know, we have all those beautiful cichlids and things, and here's Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika up in here, or rather, here, sorry guys, and then Lake Malawi being the one right down in here. So, just for reference, since we were all fish nerds, I figured we should take a look at the map. Well, here, if you're looking at this part of the world, this is where we think that all those human-like or hominid standing up, starting to get bigger brain creatures, they developed probably somewhere in this area, somewhere between Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, somewhere in here probably, and it was probably pretty tropical during that time. So, something happened, and we saw those brains go from 800 cc's all the way up to our modern day 1500 cc's. So they more than doubled from 3 million years ago when they were 500. In fact, they tripled in thinking capacity and size. Now that's not always equated, but they think it happens to be in hominids. So what was the find that they found on the banks of a river and possible lake site in Kenya? Well, it was the first aquatic meal of fish. And they found cut marks on a crocodile's foot inside of bone, as well as human bone of a burial. And they also found fossils of various aquatic animals. They found bones and pre-fossilized or partially fossilized bits of all sorts of meat that had been cut with sharp rock tools, broken and crushed open so that the bone marrow was eaten. And in the case of fish, bones don't always last, but what does usually is the enamel on the teeth of any fish that have teeth or crushing palates. And what we found at this site was that they were using tools to debone catfish, to totally pull apart turtles, and then use the shells as their own tools or jewelry or something. And that they definitely cut the meat off of crocodiles at the site, because you can see the cuts in the bone left by the stone tools, like cleaver marks. Now, we don't know who in our ancestral tree did this. We're talking again, 1.8 million years ago, but we already have evidence that there's fish in the diet of at least one of the hominids here. Way before fire, but 1.8 million years ago, probably Homo erectus, we're guessing, had the largest brain, and it began the process of getting that large brain by having access to fuel in the form of protein and calories. And this dramatic boost came in the growth of gray matter in the brain. And many anthropologists have suggested that shellfish and fish must have been on the menu for this to happen, for our brains and our ancestors' brains to grow, because they have those omega fatty acids. They have those docosahexaenoic acids and the arachidonic acids, and all the essential vitamins that we need for our brain to grow. Evolutionarily, the other primates and things did not have these. Now, at a site in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, there is no evidence of our fish-eating history. But all of a sudden, 1.8 million years ago, at this site right up in here in Kenya, they find evidence of stone flakes, and not just eating an assortment of all sorts of gazelle and things as big as hippos even, where they're finding spears and arrow points and things like that, as well as tools like stone tools for crushing and for cutting. They actually found up in here 41 bones from different catfish, 15 from larger fish, and then they found cut marks on the bones of those crocodiles, as well as the rendering of those turtles. No sign of fire, though. But this is what starts that big brain process, that starts us standing up, looking around, and being able to process, even making stone tools, is probably access to the fish in these waterways. So we are mentally, physically, we are made of fish, and we are programmed to think of fish, to seek out fish, to harvest fish. For the last 2 million years, we can prove this now. It could be longer, but at least 2 million years this has been going on. So that find is important, but an even more amazing find happened recently, and that's what really brought up this whole discussion that I want to, talk about, and why we're doing this episode today. So first we have to do a little bit of backtracking, and that is talking about how hominid species spread. You can say hominid or hominin, however you like, but 800,000 years ago is when we know that some primate-related creature, like a Homo sapien or a Homo erectus, left Africa. And this is where we find things like Peking man and Lantian man and Yaotan man. This we can see all the way down to Java, current day Indonesia. This is 800,000 years ago. We know from the tip of Indonesia up into basically modern day Russia and all of China, through India, down through the Middle East, of course, through the Levant and Egypt, that rich, fertile area that throughout time has been either hostile or very homey towards humans. It's either been a desert or it's been, kind of a tropical or semi-tropical region, pretty much most of human history. Now, Europe was cut off by a lot of ice ages later on, but before this, we know that there were other Homo ancestors that died out and definitely don't have any lineage because their DNA and their forms are just not found in the fossil record ever again, and those are in Spain and up in modern day kind of Denmark area. Now, also out in Morocco, the northern Sahara, in fact, was pretty tropical and full of lakes and kind of a series of oases, rather than just a completely desolate desert. And we're only now realizing to what degree that is. But let's keep moving on. I just wanted to show you guys that humans were not the first complex primate or hominid out of Africa. So it could be when we find evidence of fish being eaten in a bunch of bones discarded together of, say, carp, it may be that something else did it. I mean, it could be a cat, right? But if there's stone tools, it's probably going to be a human ancestor. And those stone tools are key at all these sites into helping us date which creature it is. The more important thing that we want to talk about is, when did humans really first leave? What's going on there? So really around 200,000 years ago. So we ate all that fish and all those fats on all those rivers and lakes. We probably ate so many cichlids and Nile tilapia and all sorts of stuff out of the Congo River and, any water source we could. Also, we spread down into South Africa, and we know for a fact that in South Africa, there are also places where human ancestors collected tons and tons of seashells. Now, we assume they were eating them, but we don't know for sure early on, talking 2 million years ago. But right around that same 1.8 to 2.2 million years ago, we know that our ancestors, our common ancestor of the hominids, somebody was collecting this rich protein source, and that allowed us to then develop more brain tissue. Now, some of those, like I said, died out. There was a giant species of hominids. There were smaller ones. There were probably hairy ones. There were probably less hairy ones. I mean, the amount of relatives we have, if you ever go to the Smithsonian, you'll see they have this wall of skulls and bones, and it is literally like 150 different variants that look like more human than a chimpanzee, but not quite human, but just all these variations. So what we're talking about now is when humans took over. So humans come out, and we don't know very well yet. In fact, this is all new since I was an archaeologist in grad school, but somewhere between 200,000, maybe 400,000, 500,000 years ago, our common ancestors, like Neanderthals, came out of Africa, and it was in several waves, most likely, that our precursor species came out. Now, genetically, we've proven that everybody who left Africa after around 70,000 years ago has somewhere between like 0.5% and 6% Neanderthal DNA in them. If they went into Europe, humans later on, which is like 45,000 years ago is the first humans, they interbred with Neanderthals. And Neanderthals had more complex stone tools than we did. They had more variation, and they worked bigger pieces of stone and were able to definitely pull out traits in the stone that they really would have had to think about several stages ahead, use antlers to work on, leather, more of flint knapping that we see later in humans was going on earlier in Neanderthals, and so it may have been them teaching us how to fish. We don't know exactly, but you can see this trajectory follows the Mediterranean perfectly as they leave up into Europe. As they leave out of Africa, it follows the waterline almost perfectly across through the Arabian Peninsula, then up into Iraq, over in Iran, Pakistan, India, and we get there are kind of trace groups that work their way up into, say, Afghanistan and the Central Asia, but most of them are headed along the coast, and so 50,000 could be as much as 80,000 according to some archaeologists and some anthropologists. Years ago, humans get to Australia, but we know for a fact that by 50,000 years ago, they were in Australia. So they made a lot of ground where we didn't leave Africa for all those years, for 2 million years of hominid history, 3 million if you count before our brains started to grow significantly. But as modern humans that you'd recognize today as, hey, that is a human, they were leaving Africa by 70,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago, and we know this because of a bottleneck. They could have left even earlier, and now some findings in Israel are really throwing all of this into contention, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, because that's what rewrites history for all of this, and just came out this week in 2022, in some journals in Israel, as well as a journal of nature and ecology. So then you see the speciations of North America and the Pacific and everything. But, I mean, we see people going up into China and probably Japan through connecting islands, as well as down into Papua New Guinea and places. That's happening 50,000, 45,000 years ago. And we know for a fact that 40,000 years ago, we have a skull, and we also have fishing tools like harpoons and serrated, basically wood that had pieces of sharpened shells that were able to stick fish on them. So basically harpoons for fishing, as well as nets. We know 40,000 years ago, humans were doing that up in the China region. Now, we'll talk about China again soon. We're going to be going through this whole history, obviously, but I do want to bring us up to when we started keeping fish in pens, for sure, all around the world. But it's obvious that humans either ate shellfish or fish on these journeys. The only places they spread quickly seem to follow that pattern. It seems to take longer, even within Africa, for them to get to, for instance, Western Africa, and then make it along the shores of Western Africa. Then you see progress of speciation and population all occurring all down the coastline. And lots of trial and error evolutionarily of our ancestors who didn't quite make the cut. Now, Neanderthals, they left earlier than us, we think, and they probably lived in Europe and were probably able to tolerate the cold a little bit better than us. They probably lived in Central Asia and all over the Middle East before we did, and we find their culture in the form of stone tools. Now, we know that they ate fish as well. So when we look back at creatures that we would call human, there's the Denisovans and the Neanderthals. Now, we don't it depends on who you ask whether that's human, but Homo sapien, or us, we came out of Africa 200,000 years ago is the earliest guess, and we probably mostly came out 70,000 years ago. But we first started coming out for sure. We have fossils. We know, from all over the Middle East, around 200,000 years ago, there's a wave. And by 70,000 years ago, we start seeing this explosion and people moving through the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt, the desert, and we start seeing these mix of people that are Denisovan, that are, we even have a body over Denisovan Cave, which is basically right above India and Central Asia. We have proof that Denisovan and Neanderthals, that they were able to interbreed, and just like guppies and endlers, they had a baby, and we found the body of a young girl that we were able to genetically test, and her skeleton was found being half Neanderthal, half Denisovan. Now, today in our genetics, we see that Southeast Asians are up to 5% Denisovan, and Central Asians are Denisovan and Neanderthalis. And this gets kind of controversial because, a lot of people want to say we're one species, and we're actually kind of a melting pot of at least 3 species we can prove now, and there's still a chunk of DNA that's unclaimed that probably differentiates us even more. Now, we're talking about less than 0.02% difference in humans, in all humans, but it's there, and it's something that we didn't want to address after some of the really negative things that happened when people were trying to say that different races were lesser, when in fact, if you were going to make that argument, you might be able to argue that they spent more time in the fertile areas in which our current conditions were able to be prolonged, and the eating of meat and hunting and gathering and things like that, and competition was high, whereas the others that left probably faced less competition. Now, there may have been other, great ape-like creatures. We know orangutans and other primates made it out elsewhere and also evolved elsewhere. In the old world specifically, no great apes made it to the new world. But again, we don't know for sure about the speciation and the population by Homo sapiens of the Americas. But roughly 2% of genomes of Europeans and Asians are Neanderthal. Asians also carry the additional Denisovan DNA, and up to 6% in Melanesians and Polynesians. The Africans, though, are left out of it. So that kind of proves that we mixed out in Asia somewhere, or the Middle East, with those other humanid or hominid, but I'm saying humanish, humanid groups. Now, around this same time, this is what's crazy, is this is also when we have to distinguish what's what, who's who, and who's using what tools. We start finding tools like these 40,000-year-old fishing hooks in Asia. Some are made out of abalone shell, some are made out of bones, some are made out of wood. And those things are all prone to breaking, rotting, and, you don't really want to bury them or whatnot. You don't want to lose them if you don't have to. So it's usually in shallow creeks or lake beds that we'll find these. They were probably in the lip of some fish and then basically got lost. But we also see stone tools and all sorts of other things evolving. So the new thing that is taking the story in all new directions is going to come in. We're going to jump back after I tell you. Our traditional thought was that humans speciate until about 20,000 years ago. Sometime between 10 and 20,000 years ago, they make it to the Americas, and they have boats probably, about 20,000, 30,000 years ago. They probably used rudimentary canoes or rafts. That's being rethought as well, But we know for sure that humans are reaching, island chains and places that were at least, 40, 50 miles across. We know humans were making it to Australia. There wasn't the land bridge straight to Australia. They still had to make it across the Torres Strait. So it's kind of interesting. But we assume from here out that our next contact with fish, or our next big development other than spearing fish and things like that, early on, we know that 50,000, 100,000 years ago, we find setups like this underwater where we see two walls angled like a V and then some sort of corral or trap. And this is called a fish weir, or basically a fish maze or dam. Now, some of them get really elaborate. Some are shaped in really crazy almost like a hornet trap, where they enter from one side through like a really fine passageway, and they have to find their way through this maze, and it's kind of like an inverted funnel shape. And other times, it's as simple as a fence that during high tide is tall enough for fish to go over, and during low tide it's not, and we probably rushed in with clubs and bashed the fish. So we can kind of gauge when we find stone arrangements, especially using underwater archaeology, which is a new field as well. We can kind of figure out these sites, and when we can date them properly, which is a whole other video, but just trust me, we can date stone and we can date organic matter back at least 100,000 years really well. But we see these same fishing weirs, these same things being used when Europeans first made contact with Polynesians, with North Americans and South Americans. We know that they were being used in Europe in the Middle Ages and things. So, it wasn't long ago we were still using this same technology. Hey, if it works, keep doing it. But the real controversy was, was this a delicacy? Did people just kind of like fish, or were fish part of our life, part of our growing as a species? We also find these traps, which are really easy to make. Obviously someone had to invent that at some point, and it was a crazy jump in technology. But we see these traps all over. Probably they existed sometime while humans were leaving Africa, and that is your kind of basket trap for fish. We also know that people had rattles with like shells or shark teeth or bone fragments loosely tied on them, and that they would use those to attract fish in the water. And when we made it to the Solomon Islands exploring, we actually found that exact same thing going on, and it kind of confirmed some of the discoveries of these rattles and shell. Sometimes you'd find shells in kind of a U shape, and they were, two shells, two shells, two shells. So they're slamming against each other, and some of them had chipped, and you could tell just by looking at them. Even early archaeologists knew that, okay, here's a bunch of decomposing brown-colored dirt, or in a bunch of yellow dirt or clay or something. They know that that was wood or organic matter, and the shells were all that were left. And they didn't know what it was exactly, but, thought maybe jewelry or something. Well, it turns out they were able to figure out that these were rattles used for music, or in the case of the Solomon Islands, we were able to really document a lot of amazing stuff all the way up to the era where we still have, film and photography to document this stuff. But some of the ingenious fishing methods that they were using when Europeans contacted them are probably some of the most ancient methods that are out there. So this whole idea of a fishing hook, this comes way, way, way later than the corralling and beating, clubbing, or even growing of fish in ponds or weirs. But we know by 40,000 years ago, this is when we find the first hook and line with sinkers. And these sinkers show up all over the place very quickly around 50,000 years ago. for sure more like 30,000 years ago. They are everywhere humans are. So let's hop back, because we need to talk about this initial wave of people coming out of Africa. So we know that Homo erectus, if we look back on the map, if we look a few images back, we know Homo erectus and its relatives made it out around 800,000 years ago, all the way to China. So these findings could be Homo erectus, and this is why it's so crucial what they find next at the site that hasn't been published yet. We'll have to stay tuned. But in Israel, a full 600,000 years before the flood of other humans came through, but it is very possible that humans were flirting with the idea of leaving, because we do have some remains right in this area of the Sinai and Egypt and Somalia and Ethiopia, where there are Homo sapiens. But what they recently discovered in Israel is downright incredible, and that is they have preserved where the first documentable meal of cooked food was. So they discovered a way, by using the enamel in the teeth of the fish at the site in Israel, they were able to use that enamel, and even though the bones had fallen away, they were able to use so let me think of a way to put this that's easier to say for in non-archaeology terms. But basically, we found on the Jordan River and nearby, we knew that had been inhabited for at least 1 million years by our ancestors and cousins of the human race, human species. However, just this week, they published new findings that say that humans, or at least hominids, first mastered the rudimentary use of fire, and it was fish, yet again, that helped us solve this puzzle and that are involved in this puzzle. So they found the remains of a carp-like fish at the site of Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, and it shows that fish were cooked roughly 780,000 years ago. So was this Homo erectus? Was this us? Was this early Neanderthals or their forerunners? We don't know. But we can prove that they were controlling the temperature and that they did not ignite the food, rather they heated it. And that's because of testing done in laboratories that basically shows when you heat up the teeth of these carp, they've got these bony teeth for crushing, and these carp are not little fish. This is an ancestor of the carp that is now dead because the water has dried up, or maybe because humans ate them all. But around 5,000 years ago, this carp seems to have disappeared, and they found these bony, crushing teeth-like structures in their throats, and those have enamel just like our teeth have enamel. Well, that enamel can be dated, and that enamel can be drilled into, and DNA can be found in it, just like in human teeth, which is interesting for fish species identification, especially because the rest of the bones usually rot away, especially on anything over 100,000 years ago. Fish don't have very good bone structure for fossilization. It's very rare that they last as a fossil. Now, that being said, of course, there are fish fossils. There's fossils of skin tissue even existing. It's just rare. The softer a substance is, the more porous it is, the more likely it's not going to last. Same with like thread, rope, clothing. That's why we can't prove when nets, for instance, were invented. But we can prove when sinkers that are made out of stone that clearly have eye-hole loops or notches for netting and are found in the placement where a net would have naturally draped, when those are found and then a pile of fish bones are found with cut marks from stone tools, we have a pretty good idea that humans were eating fish there. Well, same thing here is they develop new dating techniques and new techniques to tell how hot the enamel was. So enamel actually turns its chemical composition gradually at a predictable rate, depending on how hot the fire burned it. Not only that, it also predictably changes whether oxygen and flame ignited it versus whether it was indirect heat. So we can say for a fact that those bones were cooked under the earth. We can also see fire-cracked rock, and we can see that, according to this new paper, they're saying that it predates all the other sites we've ever found by 600,000 years. It's 140,000 years ago is the next most recent site. So this is this massive quantum leap in technology and in science and in what humans are doing, and it shows that we may have either us or our cousins, our relatives that later we speciated with. It shows the work of Dr. Zohar and Dr. Prevost that we or one of our cousins was eating meat. Also, in the bones of other hominids found nearby, we can say that the fish remains at Gesher Beno Yaqub were that the remains of humans rather had a really high amount of fish as their main protein. We can tell that by looking at teeth enamel and bone marrow, as well as other things like what the bones are made of themselves, isotopes and so forth. We can also date these sites by when pieces of basalt break. And if basalt has certain chemicals and compounds in it, it has crystals that will align magnetically with the Earth's magnetic alignment, true north. Just like if you float a piece of metal in water and it turns to the align with north and south. Well, little tiny microcrystals do that when you break stone. The surface layer will do that, and we can actually capture the date at which that fracture in the rock happened. Now, there's also uranium. There's also other isotope dating methods and things, and that's a really harsh, crude way, not totally accurate, of breaking it down really quickly for you guys. But that is to say that it's very well proven that the dating on this is very firm. Whether it was humans versus other human-related ancestors, the Denisovans, the Homo erectus, Neanderthals, that's what we're not sure of. But the fact that fish, yet again, is playing a role at this pivotal spot where we leave Africa, where we speciate the world, where our first successes are, the fact that this is found and that we can date that this is where the fish is cooked on purpose, that they had the mastery of fire, we can then easily say by 200,000 years ago when we left Africa, it's not a large jump at all that in 600,000 years they were able, or rather 580,000 years, they were able to learn either from other species of hominids or from ourselves doing. And shortly after we master fire, so let's skip back again. So we know we've got fishing equipment and all sorts of weirs and contraptions we use to catch fish. Well, we know that as much as 2 million years ago, so when our ancestors weren't even the same species, when they were different wings closer to other hominids, we know that somebody down there in South Africa, as well as several other locations in Africa, was able to bring fire hundreds and hundreds of yards back into caves for thousands of years on end, and cut up animal bones, do paintings, do all sorts of things back there, including bury their dead. So it proves that fire was managed, at least, even if it was caught from forest fires or whatnot. So we take the technology, the learning of using stone tools and using rudimentary fishing things that were going on. And we know early on, backtracking just to talk about how important this all was again, is we know that living in this area with all these lakes and fresh water, that is what we were eating. That was the majority of the protein. When we analyze skeletons of hominid humans, Homo sapiens specifically, there's a few others that sometimes have high levels of these omega-3s and 6s, fatty acids, and other lipids and compounds that are unique to fish. Now, omega-3s and 6s aren't, but there are specific ones that we can trace, like through isotope testing and so forth, that we can tell like that came from the organic iodine that's in, say, a shellfish, or that came from the liver of a cod or of a fish of some sort rather than a mammal. And also by analyzing DNA, but only more recently can we use the DNA. So we have to use context clues in these really old sites. So if it's over about 100,000 years, we really can't do a lot of the same testing, because all the things like fibers that they may have had, or wooden spears and things that they may have had, all we have left is the stone in many cases. The wood, and in the case of fish, the bones go away. But what we do find in these sites are the otoliths, or the little stone, it's almost like an eardrum in a fish that is like, it has tree rings on it. And every year that fish lives, another layer of calcium and nutrients are deposited on it. And so we'll find these little tiny bones, and that's why archaeologists are always sifting through the fine dirt and looking for little clues like that, because, you know, 100 years ago, we wouldn't have known what to do with that. Now we're able to see, holy cow, there's several thousand years of people having fires, and every 6 inches they dig deeper into the ground, they can see that they were having fires in the same spot underneath this rocky outcropping, and they're finding the same fish bones, as well as like gazelle that have been processed in the same way with the same cut marks. Like they use the same type of stone, the same deposits of stone that maybe sometimes from hundreds or even thousands of miles away they were trading for those things. So now let's hop up to what we know. We know we had mastery of fire for sure. Like I was saying, in those sites, even if it wasn't us, it was one of our past common ancestors. We know we had mastery of fire, but what the site in Israel shows, and again, this is a full 600,000 years before most humans left this general area. Humans kind of got to about here and then didn't seem to leave. Now, there are some really old sites right in this area, right into Jerusalem. It is interesting that so many religions and things are centered around this area, because it really is the big expansion point of how human species, how Homo sapiens got to the rest of the entire world. But it seems to be a big bottleneck. Like maybe some groups came out and then others perished. You know, maybe they just didn't make it. Maybe there were too many successful Homo erectus and then Neanderthals up here later on and so forth. But it shows in this site that one of our cousins or us was able to have the brain power, because of all that protein and everything, as early as 500,000 years to 1 million years ago. Somewhere in there, they had consistent use at this site all throughout several 100,000 years in this area of collections of sites. They had use of cooking stones, which crack under heat, and different stone cracks at different temperatures and has different breaking patterns. Well, we can compare that against lab testing, and then we know that stone cracked at 2,000 degrees in a hot flame or something. Well, then we can compare that there's cracked stones that must have been really hot right next to the otolith, or the earpiece of the fish, or the enamel from their teeth. Now, we can do DNA testing with enamel that's about I don't know what they're up to now, but I would safely say 40,000 years ago to maybe 100,000 years ago, we get pretty good dates, usually from organic matter still, and we can see what was in it with gas or mass spectrometry and gas chromatography, which is basically you pulverize stuff, turn it into a dust, and then shine light through it, and every element has a different frequency of light. It's how we can also see distant planets and know if there's water in their atmosphere, because only certain bandwidths of light reflect back from one oxygen and two hydrogens. Like that specific molecule has a light refraction window. Well, we can do the same thing when we pulverize things into a plasma or into a dust, and we can analyze like what kind of food they ate, and maybe there's like a unique seed or a unique heavy metal or something like that that's stored in their body that tells us more about it, and that's how we're dating these sites. But the fact that we knew as of 10 years ago that there were sites down in South Africa, as well as Zambia and Tanzania, that we were, Zambia being down here, Tanzania here, we knew that humans, us, Homo sapiens, were using fire very well by that point, and our brains were completely modern. Debatably, nobody debates that by 200,000 years ago they weren't. 40,000, 50,000 years ago, I already explained, they expanded out along all these waterways around the world, and you start seeing these other time periods that pop up. So probably because 40,000 years is about the best we can get these materials to last from, that's why we are seeing hooks and more elaborate, this material culture that changes from these simple hooks to the more elaborate ones like these. It's probably because of the fact that they're lasting just physically rather than that they existed. So they're probably older than this, but we haven't been able to prove that yet, and hopefully we will soon. Now, the next thing to talk about is when really history sort of starts and people start settling down. That's a full human right there in a little boat on a rice paddy. And this is in southern China, Yunnan province, and you can see where there's old layers of this terrace. And if you dig back in those, we find evidence of all sorts of incredible things. And one is that there were carp, and 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, they were making these rice paddies. They were farming by this point, and we can see that they had carp of all ages and a few other like minnows and things all in their rice field, and they're probably using them to eat algae, and then they'd eat them too. Well, somewhere around 10,000 years ago, something changes, and all of a sudden we see one pool will have only fry or baby teeny tiny enamel bones of teeth from carp. Then the next one will have medium size. Then the next one will have full size and babies. And it becomes very clear that they were figuring out that they could breed them and that they were eating them when none of them are over a certain size. There's no big, great, ancient, old ones. It's very clear that they are mastering these by this point. And this occurs all across the world. We don't exactly know when and where. Now, I have whole talks devoted to this kind of being the start of fish keeping after netting fish in, but simultaneously around the world, you see fishing methods that are just insane and creative. From in the Solomon Islands to this very day, they take spider silk and they make these kites out of palm fronds and leaves and other material, barks, and they float a bait over the water. You can actually look this up. BBC did a filming of it recently in HD and everything. But this is a Solomon Islander, and they would make these kites and they would skim with a spiderweb line. And at the bottom of that spiderweb line, there's basically a big wad of spiderweb from this giant orb-weaving spider that makes these 6 to 8 foot webs. And they wrap it all up carefully in a certain way. And then when these needlefish that are like 1.5 to up to 2 feet, a foot to 2 feet long, which have mouths that are too small to bite a traditional hook, they get their little sharp needle teeth and their beak wrapped around this when they investigate it and bite the spider silk hanging down from the kite. So it's like fly fishing. And they say they've been doing that, since time immemorial. Likewise, we also see that up in Alaska, we see evidence of the fishing weirs, like I showed how these different systems here where people are creating these fences, you can see how much would deteriorate. And when they actually went to the trouble to use rocks to create permanent versions of these, that really says something that, it wasn't just passing by. This was a multi-generational, probably, if not organized, sedentary group. So probably this is also what helped cause humans to settle down, because likewise, after we find these early hooks and evidence of the fish in our diet skyrocketing, and then us being able to cook other foods, which then gives us access to the same thing that raw fish has, some of those complex fatty acids and things, we then see far more complexity in weaving and things that are left. And that is when humans are spreading all across the world pretty swiftly, 40,000 years or so, give or take. We also find some of the first pieces of art, as we consider it, like stone relics of fertility things. But what's going on here in this picture is from the 18th dynasty in ancient Egypt and 1350 BC. So I mean, 3,350 years ago. It's a very elaborate tile mosaic, and it shows all sorts of tilapia and ducks, and there's other fish down farther on the original if you look it up. And this is showing us that they had pools, ponds. They had mastery of breeding and keeping these fish by this point. They had gardens. And, just to show, I mean, literally religions and cults start forming around odd variants in the fish. So maybe an albino one gets found. This is another 18th dynasty. Shows the whole 18th dynasty was very obsessed with fish in their diet. And very, very elaborate. This is glass, by the way. This is glass that it was lost how to make this type of glass, this opaque glass. They probably figured it out from meteor impacts in the Sahara, how that would make glass, or lightning can make glass. But it was lost until the Renaissance. That's a story for another time. But I mean, then as time goes on, all across the Mediterranean, we see people following transitory fish and also waiting for transitory fish to come back and come upriver, and things like salmon and eels and so forth. And they would wait for them, and then in the meantime, they would grow crops and things. It's kind of a chicken or the egg thing. What did they do first? But now we have some really hard evidence that fish were in the diet first, that we transitioned to these fish-heavy diets. And here is a Greek mosaic from, actually, it's more like Minoan, early Greek culture. And you can see there is a fly rod, basically. There is a modern-looking catch net. There's all sorts of different fish in the picture. There's a cast net with the weights on it, the sinkers, that we know we find 40,000 years ago all over the world, pretty much, wherever there are humans. And then we also see the seine net that you'd stretch across a river, as well as kind of the permanent structure here. Maybe there's something going on. It's hard to tell where the creek mouth is. So you can learn a lot from the art once humans have language and art and pictures to represent what they're up to. And it's just amazing to think that maybe there were these humans 50, 60,000 years ago, traveling in boats. Now, another thing is you can't just set out into the distance with Adam and Eve and start a whole society. You need a special number of people, and that number is named after a certain scientist. I forget at the moment, but basically you need to have around 28 to 32 people just so that aren't related, so that it won't be an inbred group if you're trying to speciate, like, for instance, Australia or Hawaii. So these were probably groups of several hundred, because some were related, inevitably, probably in a hunter and gathering group. But they would set out, and we see that the Polynesian islands were traveled, and as early as 60,000 years ago, people were crossing, like, the Torres Strait. They were crossing up in by Doggerland from the Netherlands across into England. That used to be walkable, actually, over to the UK, but it became an island and then it disappeared underwater. And now we want to do archaeology there because we know there were Neanderthals there as recent as probably 30,000 years ago, maybe more recent. And it's really interesting to see what our close cousins that we are literally, some of us are, I know I am, from my genealogy, I am a 4.8% Neanderthal, no Denisovan, but that makes sense because I'm predominantly African, North African, Middle Eastern, and then mostly European. And it's just really fascinating, though, how literally our being, our structural being, our muscles, our brain, the way we were able to think of the things we used to catch more fish was a feedback loop of us getting the protein to grow the brains to create history as we know it. And it just amazes me. And it's this beautiful, almost poetic circle. Now, if we want to talk about things like the fish trade on the Mediterranean, or the Azores and giant eels being captured and kept in pens, the use of, for instance, orcas and dolphins in fishing, many indigenous people speak of that very far back, and that they had these communication deals where they would give a piece of fish over to the large cetaceans, or basically, you know, whatever it may be, be it a seal or a sea lion or dolphin or whale or orca. We've seen it in South Africa. We've seen it in the Aboriginal cultures and in Tasmania and South Australia, as well as up in Alaska and northern Canada, specifically with orcas alone, not to mention dolphins in the Caribbean and in the Mediterranean, where we would train them to herd fish for us. And they too have very large brains because of all those fatty acids they're getting in the water. And this connection we have with water and wood and fire and fish and gathering in this obsessive, you know, I just need to collect a few more, storing things, just kind of what it is to be human. A lot of these innate things are all back in the DNA. I mean, they're shared. The fact that our eyesight and everything comes back from all these simple creatures, and first simple eyes and then complex ones, and if it worked, it stayed, and it gets more and more complex until we're all the way up in here. I mean, every part of the story that we're talking about today is just in the last 200,000 to 3 million years. We didn't cover more than that. We didn't even cover this picture I showed you at the beginning of the chimp starting to walk, and then the two cavemen looking hairy guys. They're not even part of this story. This was all just this last part. And fish, very realistically, helped us get to that finish line, helped us change that much more, helped us push across. explore new territories, go to new bodies of land. And there's been theories on that for a long time, including some that have been debunked and things. But now it appears very realistically that there was like a kelp highway that brought humans to the new world, even that the ice-free corridor that you may have learned about in school, that the Ice Age, well, now they know that humans were in North America before this Ice Age, the land bridge, before it opened up here. That, and there wasn't much food here for them. So it makes so much more sense to a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists that they would have come across these islands, and this would have been a shelf of land that they could have just rowed boats, canoes, rafts, whatever it may have been, and followed what would have been probably fairly temperate water here. I mean, we're only at the same parallel as about the UK is right here. So if they're not talking about crossing all the way up here, even if there were major glaciers, we now are thinking 20,000 years ago, maybe even older, humans were in the Americas. We can prove pretty much 20,000 years, give or take, now, and the Clovis culture and all that. And then it changes. So there's probably another group that did come down through there that were closer related to the genetic groups we see, the DNA of the northern Russian kind of Eastern Asiatics that came through and then mixed with probably the Clovis people who were there probably earlier. And it's even possible that the Polynesians made it across. We know that the Yanomamo, one tribe, did test positive for DNA shared with those of Easter Island, as well as some of the Pacific Islanders that actually island hopped all the way out here. And all it would have taken was ships chasing fish or out exploring new lands or getting kicked out due to battles or whatever it may have been, looking for fresh water when something dries up on a small island. I mean, Hawaii's out here right in the middle, and it was probably one of the last colonized parts of land, and we're talking 1,000 years ago, maybe 2,000, and in waves also. So it seems to be a story of not one migration ever. It always seems to be these waves, and there's probably failed ones before the successful ones also. But it's just so much of what it is to be human, and it just amazes me that this story links in so well with these hot spots of where we cross into new lands and where new entire cultures and as we say, kind of races and continents of people crossing mountains and things. We use things like dried fish, fishing lines, and jerky and those things, so that our brain would have the energy, so that we would grow big enough, strong enough, muscular enough, and to exist, to live, to be smart enough to figure out that we did want to go these places and how to catch things easier. These same areas, we know in Kadalhayak up in Turkey, there's some very ancient human settlements, 20,000, 24,000 maybe years old, that were settled. Also, we know that 20,000 years ago in Israel, yet again, on the Sea of Galilee, we find knives made out of stone that are very, very long, something like a foot long, these flint knives, and they have cereal grain fat all over them. So we know that they were cutting seasonally cereal, because some of the knives have them and some of them don't, and you can actually find them in lake beds and things where people probably dropped them. So all that is to say that we probably started settling down right in the same areas where we started fishing, where we could build these weirs, where cultural hierarchies and being able to eat enough, not that you're getting by, but that you're flourishing, and that's when culture starts. So once language and writing kicks in, and they think writing very likely kicked in because it was a way to tally what was owed. Some of the earliest writings are on little clay discs from this whole general area of the Middle East, but they're of they're something like 20 well, 15,000 years old. There's earlier symbolic writing before that, but we don't know what any of it means, and it's not consistent. But we see hash marks and dots, like 12 dots, 9 dots, 4 dots, and then a symbol, and then recurring symbols and things like that on these tokens that they would actually trade and keep track of. Well, that's 15 goats, or that's 20 of these, or whatever. And it's not till later we find out that that's what they were doing, because they wrote about it in hindsight, saying this is an ancient practice. But needless to say, this is what then gives us a surplus. So the surplus of fish, the surplus of meat, of domesticating animals and crops, and maybe taking plants that we like and putting them seasonally around the same lake areas that we're in. Whereas fish are more seasonal in the saltwater. These freshwater lakes, there's a new hypothesis as well that came out with this study coming out of Tel Aviv, where they're saying that, you know, these were basically oases. These were islands to hop out of this area into Europe by lakes, because this was a route where it was stable food. And unfortunately, those fish went extinct from the study that were cooked in the ovens because they were utilized so much. But we know that there was much more water in this region, and, you know, across the Sahara also. So there may have been crossings of Neanderthals also this way, maybe even Homo sapiens this way at one point. But we do know they came this way, and then they go along the water. Some go along up above the Black Sea, and some go clear, kind of cutting across here and following rivers. But water is key, and it seems to be fresh water, and maybe that's why people like me are drawn to freshwater aquariums. Who knows? But this excess of time, because they had food accounted for, allowed them to develop culture. And all of this is the story of how fish helped us become the humans we are today, the species that we are today. And it blows my mind. And I hope you guys enjoyed this story, and will like, subscribe, and maybe think about telling other people to check this story out if you think it's a good one, if you're thankful for all of this and you feel instinctually drawn to fish and fresh water, and I mean salt water too, but there's a definite freshwater theme of the arteries in which societies populated every spot on the world, on rivers and lakes. It's very amazing, and that our species came to be in the same kind of conditions right in this region, most likely. So thank you very much, guys. And we're going to wrap it up outside in just 1 minute, but I appreciate your time so very much. So what an amazing story. These little details, these little pieces of stone, of bone, of rock, and all the science from different disciplines across all of what humanity has learned. The mere fact that we can do that is due to fish and the extra fatty acids and proteins and lipids that we were able to gather from eating those. You know, there's all sorts of breakdowns, and it changes depending on the area you look at it. But as we've gotten more information, we can see that humans actually started eating in many places where we expand out of Africa or across land bridges and things. We are heavily eating these marine-based diets and things like kelp and fish and invertebrates and crustaceans and things that are all sea-based or freshwater aquatic-based. They were our first sedentary and also probably one of the first things we followed too, coming and going from the coastline as there were things spawning and as there were fish present or salmon coming up streams or whatever it may be. This all made it possible physically for us to have brains big enough to create the culture and to want to keep these animals and to master raising these animals. And literally with these artifacts and these finds and the gift that we share with these fish, 70% of our DNA and a lot of our primal senses and you know, just basic functions as a living organism, we share with so many things on this earth. And it's important to remember that, so that we preserve it and so that we love it that much more and feel that much more connected to it. And we couldn't do any of that without the brain to process it. So that's why this is such a fascinating story, and why it's been almost a gift of fish and of the universe and chance and or a creator, that we were able to take advantage of this. Then the fire, and then language is kind of the last step, to then after this we could start actually raising fish in captivity, spreading our knowledge amongst each other that way. And it's just an incredible story that we keep learning more and more about. If you want to hear more about this story and what happens in history, not in prehistory, before we have things written down and we are reflecting on things and continual records and so forth, when we have more than just scattered context and material culture such as tools and things, if you want to see more about like the Chinese, for instance, or Carthage, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Middle Easterns or societies, or the Pacific Island societies, and how they corralled fish, kept fish, literally started breeding fish. I've got videos on those things too. And also I come to clubs and I do talks on those things, because I think they're some of the most pivotal things about our hobby and some of the most primal things that give us this feeling of why so many of us feel like it just clicks, like it's a connection, like it's instinctually addictive to be a part of this hobby and caring for animals and fish in particular too, and just in awe and calming. And you know, there's been research done that it physically calms us, physically has health benefits. And I want to thank you guys all on this day. I'm so thankful for you allowing me to make this kind of content. And quite frankly, if I didn't have the time that you allow me to have by watching these videos, sharing these videos, liking them, being subscribed, checking out the site every once in a while, not just when you see a video up, it's you guys doing those things that really help the channel exist, because these long deep dives are not made for everyone, and they take months, if not sometimes years, for me to kind of get all these pieces from all over the place and put them together in a story. And then usually I'm brushing up on the story for a week or two right before an episode like this. And so it is complex, and yet I try to keep it casual in the storytelling of it. But it does require the time and energy and all that back history. And it's because of you guys, and those of you in particular that are members, $1.99 a month. You guys allow me to spend my time doing this as work in a city as expensive as Seattle. And if you can spare it right now, and I know times are really tight and money's tough for everyone, but any sort of you know, super thanks or like that you can do on these videos, if you really enjoyed this video, the deep dive content, even letting me know with $1 or $2, that really helps. Or if you want to be a member, if you are a member, thank you. And if you can't afford it right now, I don't want to guilt anyone. I'm just saying, if you can and you find this resource valuable, you want those extra 16 to 20 episodes a month of all the current news, research, science on what's going on in the aquarium hobby and freshwater, saltwater ecology, and you like this channel, you want to see more of this type of content on YouTube, that's the way to do it. It is to allow me to keep doing it, because I will keep doing it as long as I can and afford to keep a roof over my head, so to speak. So thank you so very much. And there's plenty of follow-up videos on the history after this and the formal history of aquariums, but there's also a lot of ancient history that I go into in some of the playlists. And also, if you just search, you know, Romans, Egyptians, or whatever you're curious about, and fish, that'll be on the channel. Check it out. Look at some of my talks that I've given to other clubs, and in those I go over some of this earliest stuff. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for watching, and fitting on this day. You know, we started in the dark, we're into the light. I'm thankful for you guys coming along this process and listening to this story of of us, of all of us. And I feel closer to you, even though I don't know who you are that's watching, but I feel closer to all of humanity knowing these things. So I thank you very much, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll talk to you next time. Have a wonderful day. See ya next video. Bye, guys.